The tray hit the stone floor with a crash that echoed through the great hall, and every wolf in the room stopped breathing. A young servant girl named Alice stood frozen beside the fallen dishes, her hands shaking, because the woman she had almost bumped into was Lady Margaret, the mother of the Alpha King. Alice opened her mouth. For one terrible second, an apology almost left her lips. Then, an older servant grabbed her arm and pulled her back so hard she nearly fell, pressing a hand over the girl's mouth before a single word could escape. Lady Margaret did not react. She stepped around the broken dishes as if they were leaves on a forest path, her gray dress whispering against the stone, and walked toward the tall doors at the end of the hall. No one looked at her directly. No one bowed. No one dared. The room stayed silent until the doors closed behind her, and only then did everyone breathe again. Alice was crying by the time the older servant dragged her into the kitchen. "Do you understand what you almost did?" the woman hissed. "Do you understand what happens to people who speak to her?" Alice shook her head, because the truth was that nobody really understood. There was only the rule, and the rule was older than Alice's time in the pack house. No one speaks to the mother of the Alpha King. Not a greeting, not a warning, not a kind word on a cold morning. Nothing. It had been this way for 12 years. 12 years ago, the old Alpha King had died, and his widow had gone silent, and then the decree had come down from the council like a stone dropped into a quiet lake. Lady Margaret was to be honored, fed, housed, and protected, but she was never, under any circumstance, to be spoken to. The punishment for breaking the rule was never written anywhere, and somehow that made it more frightening. People filled the empty space with their own fears. Some said a servant had once greeted her by accident and was sent away that same night, never seen again. Some said the rule was a curse, and that speaking to Lady Margaret would bring the curse onto your own family. Some said she was not really silent at all, that she screamed at night in her locked wing of the house, and that the walls had been built thick so no one would hear. None of them knew the truth. That was the strange power of the rule. It had lasted so long that even the people who enforced it had forgotten why it existed. Lady Margaret lived in the east wing of the pack house, in rooms that faced the mountains. Every morning, a tray of food was left outside her door by a servant who knocked twice and hurried away before the door could open. Every evening, another tray. Her clothes were washed and returned folded. Her fire was lit while she walked in the garden, timed so that she and the firekeeper would never meet. The entire household moved around her like water moving around a stone, always careful, always distant, always silent. And yet she was everywhere. That was what unsettled visitors the most. Lady Margaret did not hide. She walked the halls in daylight. She sat in the garden under the old oak tree. She attended every pack gathering, every festival, every ceremony, sitting in a carved chair at the edge of the platform, close enough to see everything, far enough that no one had to pretend she was part of it. She watched. She always watched. Her eyes were pale gray, like winter sky, and people said that when she looked at you, it felt like she was reading something written on the inside of your skin. The children of the pack were told she was a ghost. It was easier than explaining the rule. A ghost you do not speak to. A ghost you do not touch. When the little ones saw her crossing the courtyard, they would press themselves against the walls and go quiet, and Lady Margaret would pass them without turning her head, though sometimes, if you watched very closely, you might see her hand tighten on the fold of her dress. Her son was Alpha King Edward, and he was the most powerful wolf the northern packs had seen in 3 generations. He had taken the crown at 16, on the night his father died, and he had held it through storms that would have broken lesser men. Border wars, hard winters, rival packs testing the edges of his land. Edward had faced all of it with a calm, cold strength that made his warriors love him and his enemies careful. He was fair. He was disciplined. He was respected in every hall from the mountains to the sea. And he had not spoken to his own mother in 12 years. This was the part that no one could explain, no matter how many stories they invented. The decree said the pack could not speak to her. But Edward was the Alpha King. No decree in the world stood above him. He could have ended the rule with a single word. He never did. He enforced it more strictly than anyone. When his mother entered a room, Edward's jaw would tighten, and he would look at the wall, the window, the floor, anywhere but her face. At ceremonies, mother and son sat 30 steps apart and never once turned toward each other. Once, years ago, a visiting Alpha had asked Edward, politely, why his honored mother sat alone. Edward had gone so still and so cold that the visitors' own guards had stepped back, and the question was never asked again by anyone. The servants had a saying, they only whispered in the kitchen, late at night. The king rules the pack, they said, but the silence rules the king. Old Harold, the eldest member of the council, was the only person who seemed comfortable around Lady Margaret, though comfortable was perhaps the wrong word. Harold never spoke to her either, of course. But he watched her the way a man watches a locked door when he is the one holding the key. Harold was past 70 now, thin as a winter branch, with a soft voice and careful eyes. He had served 3 Alpha Kings. He knew every law, every custom, every old story. When young council members asked about the decree, Harold would fold his hands and say that some traditions protect the pack in ways the pack cannot understand, and that wise wolves do not dig up roots just to see why the tree stands. It sounded like wisdom. It ended every conversation. But Harold had one habit that a few sharp-eyed servants had noticed over the years. Whenever Lady Margaret entered a room, Harold's hands would find each other, and his thumb would press hard against his own wrist, against the thin white line of an old scar, and he would not let go until she was gone. The seasons turned, and the silence held, as it had held for 12 years. Autumn came to the mountains, painting the forests gold and red. The pack prepared for the harvest festival. Wood was stacked, lanterns were hung, the great fire pit in the main courtyard was cleaned and filled. It was the happiest time of the year, and the pack house buzzed with work and laughter. Through all of it, Lady Margaret walked her same quiet paths: garden, hall, courtyard, chapel. Her gray dress, her pale eyes, her silence, which was not peaceful if you truly looked at her, but heavy, like a held breath, like a hand pressed over a mouth. On the last night of preparations, Alice, the young servant who had dropped the tray, was carrying lanterns across the courtyard when she saw something she would remember for the rest of her life. Lady Margaret was standing alone by the well, in the dark, with her face tilted up to the sky, and her lips were moving. No sound came out. Not a whisper. Not a breath of a word. Just her lips, shaping something. Over and over. The same shape. The same silent word. Again and again, while tears ran down her face and fell without a sound onto the stones. Alice stood in the shadows, holding her lanterns, too frightened to move, and too heartbroken to look away. She could not read lips. She never learned what word the silent lady was shaping in the dark, but she told the cook the next morning, in a whisper, that whatever it was, Lady Margaret had been saying it the way a drowning person calls for the shore. The cook told her to forget it. Everyone told everyone to forget things, in that house. Forgetting was how the silence survived. But far away, beyond the mountains, on a road lined with burned trees, a young woman was walking north with everything she owned, in one small bag. Her home was gone. Her pack was scattered. She had heard there was a strong king in the north, who took in refugees, and she had nothing left to lose. Her name was Lucy, and she had never heard of Lady Margaret, or the decree, or the terrible rule that ruled the king. She would reach the gates in 3 days, and she would change everything. Lucy arrived at the northern gates soaked to the bone, because the sky had opened an hour before and had not stopped since. The guards almost turned her away. She was small, half-starved, and carried nothing but a healer's bag with a broken strap. But when she pulled back her hood, and they saw the healer's mark stitched into her collar, the older guard sent word to the house, because good healers were worth more than gold in the mountains, and winter was coming. She was given a bed in the servants' wing, a bowl of hot soup, and one instruction, delivered by a tired housekeeper who was already halfway out the door: work hard, stay out of trouble, and if you see a lady in gray, keep your mouth shut. Lucy, exhausted and dripping and grateful, thought the woman meant some strict noblewoman with a temper. She said yes, thanked her, and fell asleep before she could ask a single question. That small missed moment would shake the entire kingdom. For her first 2 days, Lucy saw nothing unusual. The pack house was enormous and busy, full of preparations for the harvest festival. She treated a kitchen burn, a sprained ankle, and a child with a fever, and she did all of it so gently and so well that by the second evening, people were already calling her the little healer from the south. She liked the house. She liked the mountains. For the first time since her home was destroyed, she slept without dreams. On the 3rd night, she could not sleep at all. She lay in her narrow bed listening to the wind, and her chest felt tight with all the things she had been too tired to feel. Her village, her father's voice, the smell of smoke. Near midnight, she gave up on sleeping and went out to walk, wrapping herself in the rough blanket from her bed, following the corridors, until she found a door that opened onto a small stone courtyard she had not seen before. The rain had stopped. The clouds had torn open, and the moon poured down into the courtyard like silver water. And there, on a stone bench beneath a bare tree, sat a woman in gray. She was older, perhaps 60, with silver hair pinned back from a face that must once have been very beautiful, and was now something better than beautiful. It was a face with a whole life written on it. She sat perfectly straight, perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, looking up at the moon. She wore no coat, no shawl. The autumn night was bitter, and the wind coming down from the mountains had teeth, and the woman sat in it as if she had forgotten that cold could touch her. Lucy did what she had done her whole life when she saw someone in need. She did not think. She did not calculate. She walked forward, pulling the blanket from her own shoulders, and said, in her soft southern accent, the 11 words that would tear a 12-year hole in the fabric of the pack. "You look cold. Please, take this. You will catch fever." The world stopped. Lucy did not know that a guard stood in the shadow of the far archway, and that he had just gone pale as milk. She did not know that above her, a window had opened, and a maid carrying candles had frozen with her hand on the frame. She did not know that the words she had just spoken were the first words addressed to this woman in 12 years, 4 months, and 9 days. She only knew that the woman in gray turned to look at her, very slowly, as if her neck had forgotten how to turn. And Lucy would spend the rest of her life trying to describe what she saw in that face. Shock, yes. But under the shock, something enormous and silent, like deep water moving under ice. The pale gray eyes fixed on Lucy, and they were shining, and the woman's lips parted, and for a moment Lucy thought she was going to speak. No sound came. The lips moved, shaped the beginning of something, and stopped, and a look of pain crossed the woman's face, so sharp and so old, that Lucy stepped forward without thinking, her healer's instincts wide awake. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "Can you speak? Squeeze my hand if you cannot speak." She held out her hand. And Lady Margaret, mother of the Alpha King, the woman no one had touched or addressed in over a decade, looked at that small open hand in the moonlight, the way a person lost in the desert looks at rain. Slowly, trembling, she reached out and took it. Her grip was cold and startlingly strong. Her eyes never left Lucy's face. And then, in complete silence, the tears came, sliding one after another down her lined cheeks, while her shoulders stayed perfectly still, as if even her weeping had learned to make no sound. Lucy, bewildered and moved, did what healers do. She sat down beside the woman, wrapped the blanket around those thin shoulders, and held her hand in the cold moonlight, murmuring the small comforts she would have offered any patient. "It is all right. You are all right. I am here. You are not alone. You are not alone." At those words, the silent woman's hand tightened on hers so hard it nearly hurt. The guard in the archway finally found his legs. He did not shout. Shouting was itself forbidden in her presence. He turned and ran, boots echoing through the corridors, toward the West Tower, toward the one person who had to be told, no matter the hour. Lucy sat with the strange silent lady for perhaps 10 more minutes, and afterward, she could never say exactly what passed between them, only that it felt less like comforting a stranger, and more like finding a door in a wall everyone else believed was solid stone. When the lady finally rose, she did something Lucy did not understand until much later. She took the blanket from her own shoulders, folded it with great care, and placed it back in Lucy's arms. Then she touched Lucy's cheek, once, lightly, the way a mother touches a sleeping child, and walked away into the dark house. Lucy went back to bed confused and strangely warm, and slept. She woke to chaos. The door of the servants' dormitory burst open before dawn, and the housekeeper stood there with a face like a funeral, flanked by 2 guards. Every other servant in the room sat up, saw who the guards were looking at, and moved away from Lucy's bed as if it had caught fire. "The southern girl," the housekeeper said, her voice shaking. "It is true then. You spoke to her." "Spoke to who?" Lucy asked, and the whole room flinched at how loudly she said it. "The lady in gray," whispered Alice from the corner, her eyes huge. "You spoke to the lady in gray." I gave a cold woman a blanket, Lucy said slowly, looking from face to face, her stomach beginning to drop, as she understood that whatever she had done, it was enormous. Who is she? The housekeeper closed her eyes, as if the question itself were painful. She is Lady Margaret, she said. She is the mother of Alpha King Edward, and no one has been permitted to speak one word to her in 12 years. The decree comes from the council, and stands with the force of law. And now you will come with us, child. Because the king has been told what you did, and the king has been awake since midnight, and the king is asking for you by name. The corridor to the great study was the longest walk of Lucy's life. Servants pressed themselves against walls to watch her pass. Somewhere behind those stone walls, she knew, sat a woman in gray, who had held her hand like a lifeline. And ahead, behind tall carved doors, waited the most powerful alpha in the north, a king, whose own mother he had not spoken to in 12 years, and no living soul outside that room knew why. The doors opened. Lucy stepped inside, and Alpha King Edward, standing at the window with his back to her, said quietly, "Close the doors. What I am about to ask you, no one else may ever hear." The doors closed behind Lucy, with a sound like a tomb ceiling, and for a long moment, the king did not turn around. He stood at the window with the gray dawn on his face, a tall man of 28, with dark hair and shoulders that carried an entire kingdom, and Lucy noticed that his hands, clasped behind his back, were not steady. Everyone in the house expected her to be banished by sunrise. The guards outside the door were already whispering about which road she would be sent down, but the first thing Alpha King Edward did when he finally turned to face the trembling healer was not to sentence her. It was to ask a question, and his voice cracked in the middle of it. "Did she answer you?" Lucy blinked. Of everything she had imagined behind those doors, she had not imagined this. The king's face was carved from stone, but his eyes were the eyes of a man standing at the edge of a cliff. "Did my mother," he said again, slower, as if each word cost him, "answer you? When you spoke to her, did she say anything? Anything at all? Even one word?" "No," Lucy said softly. "She tried, I think. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She only wept." Something went out of the king then. He turned back to the window, and his hand came up and covered his mouth, and Lucy stood in the enormous silence of that room and understood, with a healer's instinct, that she was watching a grief so old it had grown into the man like a tree growing through a fence. "She tried," he repeated at last, very quietly. "You are certain her lips moved? You are certain she tried?" "I am certain," Lucy said. "And forgive me, but I have treated people who will not speak, and people who cannot. I know the difference. Your mother is not keeping silence, my king. Something is keeping her." The words landed in the room like a stone through glass. Edward turned, and for one unguarded moment, his face was not a king's face at all. It was the face of a boy of 16, who had lost his father, and, in some way no one had ever explained, his mother, in the same season. Then the mask came back down, and he crossed the room and stood before her, studying her as if she were a message written in a language he had almost given up learning. "What is your name?" he asked. "Lucy, my king. From the south. My pack was destroyed in the spring." "Lucy from the south," he said. "Last night you broke a law you did not know existed. By every rule of this house, I should send you away today." He paused, and what he said next, he said carefully, like a man stepping between traps. "Instead, I am going to give you a position. From this morning, you are attendant to Lady Margaret. You will bring her meals, you will tend her health, you will walk where she walks, and you will do this under the decree, which means you will not speak to her, and this is the part you must hear, Lucy, from the south, because your life may depend on it. When others can see you, you will keep the law perfectly. What you do when no eyes are on you, I have not asked, and I will never ask. Do you understand me?" Lucy looked into the king's eyes, and what she saw there rearranged everything she thought she had walked into. This was not a son who had abandoned his mother. This was a son who was trying to slip a key through the bars of a cage without letting the whole world see his hand. "I understand," she said. "One more thing," Edward said, and now his voice dropped so low she had to lean in. "You will notice things, in the East Wing. You are a healer, and healers notice. Whatever you notice, you bring to me and to me alone, not to the council, never to the council." He held her gaze. especially not to Elder Harold. Before she could ask a single one of the 100 questions burning in her, the doors opened, the world resumed, and Lucy was escorted out past rows of astonished servants, no longer the southern girl awaiting banishment but, by order of the king himself, the first person in 12 years assigned to the side of the silent lady. The news went through the packhouse like wind through wheat. By midday, everyone had heard it, and no one could make sense of it. The council was reported to be in an uproar. 2 junior elders came to the king to protest, and left the study pale and quiet. And through it all, old Harold said nothing at all, which the sharpest servants found stranger than any protest. He simply stood at the end of the great hall, as Lucy passed by with her healer's bag, and he watched her with his careful soft eyes, and his thumb pressed and pressed against the old white scar on his wrist. That evening, Lucy carried Lady Margaret's supper tray to the east wing herself. Her hands shook slightly as she knocked twice on the tall door, and then, breaking 12 years of custom, she did not hurry away. She stood and waited. The door opened. Lady Margaret looked at the tray, then at the girl holding it, and her pale eyes went very wide. Lucy said nothing, because a guard stood at the end of the corridor. She only bowed her head, and then, hidden from the guard by the angle of the door, she smiled, small and warm and unmistakable, the smile of last night, the smile that said, "It is me. I came back. You are not alone." Lady Margaret stepped back and opened the door wide, inviting her in for the first time in 12 years, and as Lucy crossed that threshold she felt the strangest sensation, as if the whole silent house behind her were holding its breath. The rooms of the East Wing were clean, beautiful, and heartbreaking. Everything was in perfect order, and nothing had been touched by another human hand in years. Lucy set down the tray, and while Lady Margaret ate, slowly, and with the astonished care of someone unused to company, Lucy's trained eyes began, quietly, to notice. She noticed that the lady's hands bore old burn scars across both palms, long-healed, the kind that came from gripping something searing and refusing to let go. She noticed that at the far end of the corridor there was a door with an iron lock, and that the dust on the corridor floor stopped in a clean line before it, as though even the dust obeyed some boundary. She noticed a shelf of books with one empty space, conspicuous as a missing tooth. And she noticed that when a log settled loudly in the fire, Lady Margaret's whole body flinched, and her hand went to her own throat, pressing flat against it, as if checking that something there was still holding. A healer notices, and what this healer was beginning to understand, with a cold feeling climbing her spine, was that she had not been assigned to comfort a grieving widow. She had been sent into a locked room to find out what was locking it, and somewhere in this silent, beautiful, frightened house, someone had spent 12 years making sure that no one ever did. The first thing Lucy learned in her new position was that Lady Margaret could hear everything and answer nothing, and that this was not grief, and it was not choice. It was a wall. And walls, Lucy knew, are built by someone. The proof came on her 4th morning in the East Wing. Lucy had brought paper and a stick of charcoal, hidden in the bottom of her healer's bag, and when the corridor was empty she set them on the table before Lady Margaret with her heart pounding. If the lady could not speak, she could surely write. It was so simple. Lucy could not understand why no one had thought of it in 12 years. She understood 30 seconds later, and she never forgot it. Lady Margaret looked at the paper, and her whole face lit with a hope so bright it was painful to see. She seized the charcoal, she set it to the page, and her hand stopped, not hesitated, stopped, as if an invisible grip had closed around her wrist. Lucy watched the lady's arm tremble with effort, watched the tendons stand out, watched sweat break on her forehead as she fought her own hand for the length of 10 heartbeats. The charcoal snapped in her grip, and Lady Margaret dropped it and pressed both scarred palms flat on the table, breathing hard, and looked up at Lucy with eyes that said, more clearly than any writing could, "Now you see. Now you finally see." "It is not silence," Lucy whispered. "It is a binding." At the word binding, Lady Margaret went very still. Then, slowly and deliberately, she did something she had never done before. She raised her hand to her own throat and drew one finger across it, not like a threat, but like someone tracing the line of a collar no one else could see. Then she pointed, through the wall, in the direction of the great hall, where at that very hour, the council was meeting. And her pale eyes were not sad anymore. They were burning. Lucy's blood ran cold. "Someone in this house did this to you," she breathed. Lady Margaret did not nod. She did not need to. From that morning, the East Wing became a place of quiet investigation. To the household, Lucy was simply the strange southern attendant, carrying trays and tending the fire. Behind the tall doors, she and the silent lady built a language of their own. One tap of the finger for yes, two for no, a flat hand for danger. And with this fragile bridge, question by question, Lucy began to pull 12 years of darkness into the light. Was the binding placed on her after the old king died? One tap, yes. Did the council know? A long stillness. Then one tap, but slow, heavy, as if the answer had corners. Some of them, Lucy guessed aloud. Not all. One tap, yes. Did her son, the king, know of the binding? Two taps, quick and fierce. No. And then Lady Margaret did something that broke Lucy's heart. She took Lucy's hand and pressed it against her own chest, over her heart, and her eyes filled, and Lucy understood the message as clearly as speech. He does not know. He was a boy. They let my son believe I chose this. They let him believe his mother went silent on him by her own will, and I have watched him carry that wound for 12 years, and could not reach across it. She sat in her small room, and thought about the king's cracked voice asking, "Did she answer you?" And she wanted to weep for both of them, the mother and the son, living 30 steps apart with a lie between them like a canyon. But it was the locked door that pulled at her most. The iron lock at the end of the east corridor, where the dust stopped in a clean line. When Lucy had walked toward it on her second day, simply to look, Lady Margaret had appeared beside her with frightening speed, and gripped her arm, and shown her a flat hand. Danger. Yet twice since then, Lucy had caught the lady standing before that door in the evening light, one scarred palm resting against the wood, her forehead nearly touching it, the way one stands at a grave. "What is in that room?" Lucy asked softly on the 6th evening. Lady Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she led Lucy to the bookshelf, to the empty space that gaped like a missing tooth, and touched it. Whatever lay behind the iron lock, it belonged to the missing book. And the missing book, Lucy realized with a chill, had been important enough that someone had taken it and locked away everything it touched. The 7th day brought the fright that changed everything. Lucy was returning from the kitchens with the supper tray when she turned the corner of the east corridor and nearly walked into Elder Harold. The old man stood exactly where he should not have been, 3 steps from Lady Margaret's door, his thin frame wrapped in his council robes, his soft eyes bent on the iron lock at the corridor's end. He turned when he heard her, and smiled, and the smile was gentle and grandfatherly, and it frightened Lucy more than a raised fist would have. "The little healer from the south," Harold said warmly. "How good of the king to give our dear lady some company at last." His eyes drifted over her, over the tray, over her healer's bag, and lingered on the bag one heartbeat too long. "Tell me, child, in your days here, has Our Lady seemed—" He paused, selecting the word like a man selecting a knife. "Peaceful." "She is quiet, Elder," Lucy said carefully. "As is the law." "As is the law," Harold agreed pleasantly. He stepped past her, then stopped, close enough that she could smell old paper and candle smoke on his robes, and his voice stayed soft as lamb's wool. "A word of kindness, little healer, from an old man who has seen much. Some silences in this world are mercies. Wolves who go digging under them find things that bite. It would grieve me deeply if the South lost such a promising healer twice." He patted her shoulder with a dry, light hand and walked away down the corridor, and Lucy stood holding the tray until her arms ached, because she did not trust her legs to move. When she entered the rooms, Lady Margaret took one look at her face and knew. Lucy set down the tray and knelt before the silent lady and whispered the question she already knew the answer to. "The binding on you. Was it Harold?" Lady Margaret's whole body began to tremble. And then, instead of tapping yes, she pulled back her sleeve and turned her arm to the firelight and showed Lucy something the loose gray dresses had hidden for 12 years. High on her forearm, old and white and unmistakable, ran a thin scar. It was identical, Lucy realized, her skin turning to ice, identical in length and place to the scar on Elder Harold's wrist that he pressed and pressed whenever the silent lady entered a room. "A binding," Lucy whispered, "sealed in blood, holds 2 people, not 1. And somewhere down the dark corridor, behind them, faint but distinct, came the sound of the great door of the east wing, clicking softly shut. Someone had been listening. Lucy did not sleep that night, and by morning she had made a decision that would either save the Silent Lady or destroy them both. If the answer to the binding existed anywhere, it existed in writing, and if it existed in writing, it existed in the one place in the pack house where writing went to be forgotten: the archives. Getting in was easier than she dared hope. The archives lay beneath the West Tower, 3 floors of cold stone and old paper watched over by a single keeper, a nearsighted man named Peter who loved 2 things in the world: order and gooseberry tea. Lucy arrived with a jar of gooseberry preserve from the kitchens and a story about researching old remedies for the lady's health, and Peter, delighted by the first visitor in months, who did not track mud on his floors, waved her in and forgot her within the hour. She searched for 6 days, 1 stolen hour at a time. She learned quickly that the archive had a wound in it. The records of the pack ran back 300 years, orderly as soldiers, ledgers and laws and letters, season after season. But around the death of the old king, 12 years ago, the shelves went strange. Pages razored from ledgers so cleanly that only the stubs remained. A council record book with its binding intact and its middle gone. The official account of the old king's death consisted of 4 lines. He had fallen in a border skirmish. He had died with honor. He was mourned. His son had risen. 4 lines, for a king who had ruled 20 years. Lucy had seen kitchen accounts that recorded the loss of a soup pot in more detail. Someone had gone through this archive like a careful thief through a house, taking not everything, only the truth. But careful thieves make one mistake. They take what is written, and they forget what is copied. On the 6th day, in a crate of water-damaged books awaiting repair, Lucy found the apprentice ledgers, the rough copies young scribes made for practice, before entries were written fair into the great books. No one razored practice pages. No one even remembered them. And there, in a smudged young hand, in a copy of a court record from the year before the old king died, Lucy found the entry that stopped her breath. By order of the council, the teaching of the old tongue is henceforth forbidden in all territories of the northern packs. All texts of the first language are to be surrendered to Elder Harold for keeping. Exception is granted to none. Those who speak the old words aloud do so under peril of law. The old tongue. Lucy read the entry 3 times. She had heard of it only in fireside tales, the first language of the packs, the language wolves had spoken before they spoke as men, a language said to be older than the mountains and heavy with power, and it had been outlawed, all of it, gathered into the hands of one man, in the very season the old king began his final year. Every text surrendered to Elder Harold. The empty space on Lady Margaret's bookshelf rose in Lucy's mind like a ghost. She went deeper. If the language was that old, the oldest shelves might hold what newer ones had lost, and the razor that had gone through the ledgers might not have thought to climb all the way down into the roots of the archive. In the lowest room, where the air tasted of stone and centuries, she found a chronicle so old its leather had gone to powder at the corners, a book of the first laws, written before the packs had kings at all. And by the light of a shaking candle, Lucy read about the oath of silence. The old law was plain, and it was terrible. In the first days, when a wolf witnessed a deed so grave that speaking of it could shatter a pack, the elders possessed a right to bind the witness in silence, sealed in blood from the arm of the binder and the arm of the bound. The chronicle called such a bound person by a single word in the old tongue, Valen, the witness, and the law was strict about what the binding was for. It was a shield, meant to be temporary, meant to protect the witness until the pack was strong enough to bear the truth. To leave a soul bound beyond its season, the chronicle said, was to steal their voice, their pen, and their peace, and was counted among the gravest wrongs one wolf could do another. Lucy's candle trembled, their voice, their pen. She saw again the charcoal snapping in Lady Margaret's fighting hand. She read on, and found the door out. A binding of silence, the old law said, is not broken by force, nor by the death of the binder, for it is anchored in the blood of both. It is released in one way alone. The word Valen must be spoken aloud, in the old tongue, in the hearing of the pack, so that the pack itself calls its witness to speak. But mark this well, the word has no power in the mouth of the binder, nor in the mouth of one who speaks it, in fear or under command. It must be offered freely, or claimed freely, before the gathered pack, under the open sky. Before the gathered pack, under the open sky. Lucy sat back on her heels in the cold dark, and above her head, Faint through 3 floors of stone, she could hear the sounds of the household hanging the last lanterns, because the harvest festival, the great gathering of the whole pack under the open sky, was 2 nights away. Everything connected at once, and the shape it made was so clear and so ugly that Lucy felt sick. Harold had not merely silenced a grieving widow. He had gathered every text of the old tongue into his own hands first, so that no living soul would remember the word that could free her. He had outlawed the language itself, and called it tradition, and stood guard over the silence, for 12 years with his gentle smile and his careful eyes. The decree that no one may speak to Lady Margaret was the final lock. A bound witness could not ask for the word. So Harold had made certain no one could ever speak to her long enough to learn there was a word to ask for. He had built a cage out of law and hung it with the flag of mourning, and the whole pack had bowed to it for 12 years. Lucy copied the old pages with a shaking hand, hid the copies in the lining of her healer's bag, and climbed out of the archive into the evening light. She had the word. She had the way. She had 2 days. She crossed the courtyard toward the east wing, forcing her steps to stay slow and her face to stay dull, just a tired attendant at the end of a long day. She had nearly reached the east door when a voice stopped her, warm as a shawl and soft as snowfall. "Little healer, you have dust on your sleeves." Elder Harold stood in the shadow of the archway, his hands folded, his head tilted with kindly concern. Lucy's heart slammed once, hard. She looked down at her sleeves, gray with archive dust, and then up into his soft, careful, patient eyes, and she smiled the most innocent smile of her life, and said the kitchens had put her to beating rugs. "Of course," Harold said pleasantly. "Rugs." He held her gaze 1 heartbeat longer than kindness required. "Rest well, child. The festival is nearly upon us. It would be a shame to be too tired to enjoy it." He walked away into the dusk, unhurried, and Lucy stood by the east door with the old word burning in the lining of her bag, and one certainty turning to iron in her chest. Whatever was going to happen, it had to happen at the festival, because Harold was no longer wondering whether she was digging. He was deciding what to do about it. The night of the harvest festival arrived with a full moon so bright the mountains looked carved from silver, and it brought with it an uninvited guest. Riders were sighted at sunset, a column of them coming up the North Road under a banner no one wanted to see. Alpha Victor of the Iron Ridge Pack, master of the lands beyond the mountains, a broad, smiling, dangerous man who had spent 5 years probing the edges of Edward's territory the way a wolf probes a fence. By ancient custom, no alpha could be turned away from a harvest gathering. Victor knew it. That was exactly why he came. So the great courtyard filled under the full moon with the entire northern pack, 100 strong, the fire pit roaring, the lantern light swaying, and on the high platform sat Alpha King Edward, with a face like winter, and 30 steps to his left, in her carved chair at the edge of everything, sat Lady Margaret in her gray dress. And in the crowd below, with her healer's bag pressed against her side, and an old word hidden in its lining, stood Lucy, waiting for a moment she could not predict and could not force. The word must be offered freely, or claimed freely, before the gathered pack, under the open sky. She had whispered the whole of it to Lady Margaret the night before, watched the silent lady read the copied pages by firelight with tears streaming down her still face, watched her trace one word over and over with a scarred fingertip. Valen, Valen, Valen. Elder Harold stood at the king's right hand, resplendent in his council robes, and his careful eyes never stopped moving across the crowd. The feast was served, the songs were sung, and then Alpha Victor rose, cup in hand, to give the guests' blessing, and instead lit a fire in the middle of the gathering. He praised the harvest, he praised the hall, he praised the strength of the north, and then, smiling, he turned that smile toward the edge of the platform, toward the woman in gray, and let his voice roll out over the silent crowd. But tell me, friends, for all the packs beyond the mountains ask it, and I confess I have no answer. What strength is truly in a bloodline where the king's own mother sits apart like a shadow? 12 years, they say, and not one word between mother and son. In my lands, we would call that a broken house. And a broken house, friends, however tall, wants only one storm. The courtyard went so quiet that the fire seemed loud as a landslide. Edward rose slowly to his feet, and the power that came off him made the nearest lanterns tremble, and everyone present understood that the North stood one insult from something that could not be undone. Victor's warriors shifted their feet. Harold glided forward, hands raised, voice flowing like warm oil. Honored Alphas, peace, peace. This is a night of harvest. And some silences, good Victor, are sacred to us. Ancient tradition, not weakness. Let no guest mistake the one for the other. And that was the moment. Lucy saw it before it happened, saw it in the way the gray figure at the edge of the platform rose from her carved chair. 12 years of stillness, and now Lady Margaret was standing, under the open sky, before the gathered pack, with every eye in the courtyard swinging toward her, because she had never, in anyone's memory, stood at a gathering. Harold saw it too. His voice cut off mid-word, and his hand went to his wrist. Lady Margaret walked to the center of the platform. She looked out over the hundreds of upturned faces, the pack that had not addressed one word to her in 12 years, and then she turned and looked at her son, and Edward stood frozen, and something passed between their eyes that made him whisper, so quietly, only the platform heard it, "Mother." She lifted her chin. She placed one scarred hand flat over her own heart, the claiming of a right, exactly as the old law prescribed, and from a mouth that had been sealed for 12 years, 4 months, and 20 days, working against a binding that fought her for every fraction of sound, Lady Margaret dragged one single word up into the moonlight and spoke it aloud to her pack. Valen. The word did not sound like a word. It sounded like a mountain shifting. Every torch in the courtyard guttered flat at once, as if a great breath had passed over the world, and the full moon seemed to pour down twice as bright, and hundreds of wolves felt the hair rise on their necks, as something older than any of them moved through the gathering, like wind through wheat. And two things happened in the same heartbeat. Elder Harold made a sound no one had ever heard from him, a short, broken cry, and clutched his wrist as the old white scar there split its seal, and he dropped to his knees on the platform with his face gone gray as ash. And Lady Margaret drew in one enormous, shaking breath, the first free breath in 12 years, and when it came back out, it came out as a voice, cracked, rusted, unused, and unmistakably, unstoppably alive. "My name," she said, and the whole courtyard swayed at the sound of it, "is Margaret. I am the widow of your fallen king, and I have been silent for 12 years, my pack, not because I chose it." She turned, slowly, and leveled her pale burning eyes on the old man kneeling on the platform. "But because on the night my husband died, I saw what was done to him, and who did it, and the man who bound my voice in blood to hide it is kneeling before you now." The courtyard erupted. Victor's smile vanished. Edward stood in the roaring chaos staring at his mother, his crown, his whole understanding of his own life breaking apart and remaking itself in his face. And above the uproar rang the voice of a lady 12 years silent, and it was not weeping now, it was iron. "Sit down, Harold," she said. "You kept me listening for 12 years. Tonight, the pack will learn how it feels." It took the guards several minutes to quiet the courtyard, and when the roar finally sank to a fierce, crackling silence, every soul in the North stood waiting for a story 12 years overdue. Edward had not moved. He stood beside his mother on the platform like a man afraid that if he touched her, the moment would prove to be a dream. Victor and his riders, sensing that history was happening in front of them, had gone very still and very attentive at the edge of the firelight, and Harold knelt where he had fallen, no longer soft, no longer careful, just old, with 2 junior guards standing over him at the king's sharp gesture. Lady Margaret's voice grew stronger with every sentence, like a stream remembering its bed. 12 years ago, she began, my husband, your king, did not fall to an enemy at the border. That is the story you were given, and it was built for you, line by line, by men he trusted. The truth is smaller and uglier. Your king died 3 miles from this courtyard, at the old hunting lodge by the river, on a night he believed he was meeting his own council in secret session. She let that settle over the crowd like snow. You will ask how I know. I know because I followed him. A wife knows when her husband carries a weight he will not name, and mine had carried one for a season. He had discovered something rotten in his own house. Silver from the pack treasury, flowing quietly south for years, into the hands of rival packs, buying influence, buying warriors, buying patience, for a plan whose season had not yet come. My husband had traced the rot to its root, and the root was on his own council. He called the secret session to lay the proof before the honest elders and cut the rot out. He never laid it before anyone. The men he summoned were the very men he had discovered, and they knew why they had been called. I reached the lodge in time to see, through the window, my husband fall among men he had trusted for 20 years. I saw their faces in the lamplight. I have carried those faces for 12 years. There were 5. The courtyard did not roar this time. It had gone past roaring, into that terrible listening stillness of a pack scenting blood in its own den. I ran, Lady Margaret said. I was seen, and I made the mistake that cost me 12 years. In my terror, I did not run to the pack. I ran to the one elder I was certain stood outside the rot, the gentlest man on the council, my husband's oldest advisor. I ran through the woods to Harold, and I poured out everything I had seen, every face, every detail, into his kind and careful ears. And Harold held my hands, and wept with me, and told me I was in terrible danger, and that he knew an old rite that would shield me until the guilty could be brought down. A shield of silence, he called it. Temporary, he called it. He cut his arm, and he cut mine, and I let him do it, because I trusted him, and because I was afraid. She pulled back her gray sleeve, and held up her scarred forearm to the torchlight, and hundreds of eyes moved from her white scar to the split, seeping scar on the wrist of the kneeling elder, and the last doubt in the courtyard died. By morning, she said, I understood what I had truly let him do. Harold was never outside the rot. Harold was the root. The 4 who acted at the lodge acted on his design, and when their deed handed him a witness, he did not silence me with cruelty, which the pack might have noticed. He silenced me with law. Within a month, the council he steered had forbidden the old tongue and gathered every text of it into his keeping, so that the one word that could unbind me vanished from living memory. And then came the decree, dressed as reverence. No one may speak to the grieving widow. Do you see it now, my pack? Do you see how perfect it was? A witness who cannot speak, cannot write, and may not be spoken to, is not a witness. She is a portrait on a wall. I have hung on the wall of this house for 12 years, watching the man who arranged my husband's end grow old with honor at my son's right hand. Then her voice changed, and every parent in the courtyard heard the change, because iron went out of it and grief came in. But that is not the worst thing Harold did. The worst thing was done to my son. She turned to Edward, and the king, before his whole pack, was simply a son, his face open and undefended for the first time in his reign. You were 16, she said softly. You had lost your father in the night. And in the days after, when I could not speak, could not write, could not even weep aloud, they told you a gentle lie. They told you your mother's silence was grief, that I had turned from the world by choice, and from you. I watched you come to my door, Edward. 11 times that first year, I counted, and stood inside with my hands against the wood, while you asked me through it to say anything, one word, and I fought that binding, until my palms burned on the iron of the latch. I watched you stop coming. I watched the hurt turn to anger, and the anger to a wall taller than mine. For 12 years, I have watched my only child believe his mother abandoned him with an entire pack for witness, and of everything that was stolen from me at that lodge, that theft was the greatest. Edward made a sound then, low and broken, that no warrior of the North ever repeated afterward, out of love for him. He crossed the platform in 3 steps, and the Alpha King of the North took his mother in his arms in front of the whole world, and held her the way a drowning man holds land, and the courtyard, hundreds of hard mountain wolves, wept openly under the full moon. Only 2 people in that courtyard were not weeping. One was Harold, kneeling in the wreckage of 12 years of careful work, his eyes darting, already calculating, because old spiders do not stop spinning merely because a web is torn. And the other was Alpha Victor of Iron Ridge, standing at the fire's edge with his cup still in his hand, watching the strongest pack in the mountains discover a rot in its own council, in front of his eyes, on his lucky night. Silver, flowing south for years, the lady had said, buying influence beyond the mountains. Victor looked down into his cup so no one would see his face, and turned one thought over and over like a coin. She had said there were 5 faces at the lodge window. Harold made 4 of the 5, with the 3 he directed, and no one on that weeping platform had yet asked the question Victor was already asking. Who was the 5th? The reckoning began before the fire pit had burned down to coals. and it nearly tore the pack apart faster than any enemy could have. Lady Margaret named the faces from the lodge window, one by one, in a steady voice, and the crowd turned with each name like a single animal. Harold. Elder Bram, keeper of the treasury, which explained 12 years of silver moving like water under a frozen river. Master Colin, captain of the old king's personal guard, the man who had testified about a border skirmish no one else had survived to describe, and Elder Gareth, who had drafted the decree of silence with his own famous pen. 4 names. The 5th face, Lady Margaret said, she had never known. It had stayed back from the lamplight, hooded, and in 12 years of turning that window over, in her mind, she had recovered everything about it, except what mattered. Bram and Gareth were not in the courtyard to hear themselves named. Sharp-eyed servants reported that both had slipped out during the lady's story, and within the hour it was confirmed that they had taken horses from the far stable and gone into the mountains in the dark, which was as good as a signed confession, and twice as dangerous, because men with their knowledge and their silver did not run without a place to run to. Colin did not run. Colin stood up in the second row of the gathering, in front of everyone, and swore on the moon that the lady was mistaken, grief-addled, that he had loved the old king like a brother, and he kept swearing it right up until 2 of his own former guardsmen, weeping with rage, stepped away from him, and he saw in the pack's eyes that the 12-year story was over. Then he stopped swearing and stood very still and let himself be taken. And Edward, standing over Harold with the torchlight in his eyes, came within one breath of ending the whole matter there and then. The pack would have let him. That was the terrifying thing. The courtyard that had wept 10 minutes earlier was now a single low growl, hundreds strong, grief curdling into fury, at the speed only betrayal can manage, and the growl had one desire, and the desire had one direction. The strongest alpha in 3 generations stood over the architect of his father's death and his mother's 12 stolen years, and his hands were shaking, and the whole North was silently begging him to do the one thing that could never be undone. It was Lucy who stepped onto the platform. Afterward, no one could quite say how the small southern healer found the courage, but everyone remembered what she said, because she said it clearly, and she said it to the whole pack, not just the king. She held up the copied pages from the deep archive, and she reminded them what the old word meant. Valen, not the avenger, the witness. My king, she said. The old law did not free your mother's voice, so the pack could stop listening the moment it grew angry. It freed her to testify. A witness needs a trial. If Harold falls tonight, here, in the dark, his secrets fall with him. 4 conspirators become ghosts and rumors. The silver trail south goes cold, and the 5th face at that window stays a face forever. And there is one thing more, my king. Your mother did not survive 12 years of silence, so that her first free night would end with her son doing something in rage that Harold, even now, on his knees, is hoping you will do. Look at him. He is not afraid of your judgment. He is afraid of your patience. Every eye went to Harold, and it was true, and everyone saw that it was true. The old man's darting eyes had gone flat and unreadable, but at the word trial, something in his face had tightened that had not tightened at the growl of the crowd. Edward stood for a long moment at the edge of himself. Then Lady Margaret crossed the platform and laid her scarred hand over her son's shaking one, and she said, quietly, but in the voice of a queen, 12 years, Edward. I did not endure them for his death. I endured them for the truth. Give me my trial. And the king stepped back. Harold and Colin were taken to the stone cells beneath the west tower. Riders were dispatched into the mountains after Bram and Gareth, and the pack of the north learned something about its young king that night that no border war had ever taught them, which was that his strength had a rider, and the rider was his will. But the night was not finished with them. An hour before dawn, with the courtyard finally emptying and the fires burning low, Alpha Victor of Iron Ridge requested a private word with the king, and in the small hall off the courtyard, with only Edward, Lady Margaret, and a grey wolf of a bodyguard for witness, Victor put down his smile for the first time in anyone's memory, and showed what lived behind it. I will speak plainly, he said, because tonight has made plain speaking cheap. Your house has just opened its own chest, and shown the mountains the rot inside. 2 of your elders are riding through my passes as we speak, carrying 12 years of your secrets, your treasury routes, your border postings, and a bottomless grudge. By custom I could sit back and let your wound fester, And in 1 year, perhaps 2, the North would be mine, without my breaking a single law of hospitality. He let that sit. Or, Edward said, flat as a blade. Or you hear what I came to your festival already knowing, Victor said, and for the first time his eyes moved, briefly, to Lady Margaret, with something in them that was almost respect. Your silver did not only buy patience in the South, lady. Some of it, over the years, bought whispers in my hall. I have had a rat of my own, and I have let it run, waiting to learn who fed it. Tonight you named 4 names, and none of them is the name my rat answers to, when it thinks no one is listening. Your 5th face, the hooded one who stood back from the lamplight. Victor smiled again, and this time there was no warmth in it at all, only the long patience of a rival who has waited 5 years for the door of the North to open 1 finger's width. I know who it is, he said, and the price of the name is a conversation about my boarder. The fire cracked in the silence. Lady Margaret, 12 years a silent witness, and 1 night a free woman, looked at the smiling Alpha of Iron Ridge, and then at her son, and spoke the last words of that endless night. Then let us converse, she said. But know one thing first, Victor of Iron Ridge. I have spent 12 years reading faces that believed no one was watching. You have known this name 5 years and sat on it, waiting for the hour it would buy the most. She stepped closer, and her pale eyes did not blink. Sell it carefully, because when the trial begins, I will be watching your face too. The trial was set for the 7th day, and on the evening before it, the pack house held its breath around a single closed door, because for the first time in 12 years, mother and son were alone in a room together, and everyone in the North understood that whatever happened at the trial tomorrow, the thing happening behind that door tonight mattered more. It began badly, as true things often do. Edward had come to her rooms in the East Wing, carrying a folder of trial documents, because he was a king, and documents were his armor, and for the first minutes they sat across her small table, speaking of witness order and evidence, like 2 officials, both of them polite, both of them careful, both of them drowning. It was Lady Margaret who finally pushed the folder aside with 1 scarred hand and said, Edward, look at me. We have 30 steps and 12 years between us, and no trial is going to cross them. Only we can. So I will go first, because I have the most to answer for. You, he said, startled. You have nothing to. I have this, she said. You were 16, and your father was gone, and you knocked on that door behind you 11 times, and I did not open it. I want you to hear, from my own freed mouth, what those 11 nights were, because you have spent 12 years imagining them wrongly. And she told him how she had stood with her forehead against the inside of the door while he pleaded through it, how the binding had let her hear everything and answer nothing, which she had come to believe was Harold's true cruelty, because a shield of silence did not need ears. How on the 8th night, the night he had stopped asking her to speak, and simply sat down against the outside of the door, and told her, in a boy's cracking voice, about the crown they were putting on him. She had fought the binding so hard that she had gripped the iron door latch until it seared her palms, and how she had held on anyway, because the pain was the only voice left to her, and some animal part of her had believed that if she could not reach her son with words, she would reach him with will. She turned her hands over on the table, palms up, and showed him the old burn scars he had wondered about across the room at ceremonies for a decade, and Edward, Alpha King of the North, put his face into those scarred hands, and wept like the 16-year-old who had sat against that door. Then it was his turn, and his confession was harder, because hers had been imprisonment and his had been belief. I hated you, he said into her hands, and made himself say it plainly, without softening. By the 3rd year, I hated you. It was easier than missing you. Harold would sit with me, those first winters. He never spoke against you, that was his art. He defended you, gently, endlessly, in exactly the way that fed the poison. Grief takes some wolves inward, my boy. We must respect your mother's choice, and every word built the wall higher. I made my whole reign on that wall, mother. Cold, contained, needing no one. They call it my strength in the border songs. It was only a boy deciding that if his own mother would not speak to him, he would become someone who never needed to be spoken to again. And she came around the small table and held her son, and told him the thing that broke the wall for good. That is why I could bear it, she said. Do you think I held on 12 years for justice alone? Justice is cold porridge. I watched you from 30 steps away becoming a king with a locked room inside him, and I stayed alive and sane for one reason, Edward. Someone had to be left who knew the room was a lie. Someone had to survive to tell you that you were never abandoned. Not for 1 hour, not for one night. There was never a moment your mother did not love you. There was only a door, and a coward's right, and 12 years. And the 12 years are over. They talked until the candles drowned in their own wax, and the guards in the corridor outside, who could hear nothing but the rise and fall of two voices, one deep and one silver, reported afterward only that sometime past the middle of the night, they heard something from inside that room that no living wolf had ever heard before. The Alpha King, laughing, not the short cold laugh of the council chamber, laughing helplessly, like a boy, at some story his mother was telling him, and then both of them laughing, the sound tangling together through the door and down the stone corridor of the east wing, where it echoed off an iron lock at the end of the hall. Because there was one more door to open that night. Near dawn, Lady Margaret took a candle and led her son down the corridor to the locked room, and told him what the missing book was. Not a text of the old tongue. Something Harold had wanted hidden even more. Your father's own hand, she said, his private ledger. The proof he was carrying to that secret session, the names, the sums, the years of silver, everything. They believed it lost at the lodge. It was never at the lodge. He was too careful for that. He locked it in this room the evening he rode out, and the key he left where only I would think to look, and in 12 years, bound as I was, I could not even point at this door without fighting my own hand. Harold razored the archives, hunted rumors, locked this wing behind a decree, and grew old. 3 steps from the only witness, and 30 steps from the only proof, certain that both were sealed forever. She drew from the lining of her gray dress a small iron key, warmed by 12 years of being carried against a silent heart, and gave it to her son. Tomorrow the pack will hear my voice, she said, but a witness can be doubted, Edward. Grief-addled, Colin called me, and others will whisper it. Your father cannot be doubted. Let him testify. Edward turned the key. The lock, oiled by no one for 12 years, resisted, then gave. And in the gray light of dawn, on his father's writing desk, exactly where a careful king had left it on the last evening of his life, lay a plain leather ledger, and pressed beneath its cover, in a firm hand, Edward had almost forgotten, a single folded page, bearing 3 words that undid him one final time. For my son. At the trial that morning, the North would learn every name and every number, but those who stood closest to the platform would remember something else all their lives. That when the Alpha King rose to open the proceedings, ledger in hand, he did not stand alone at the center, as he had stood for 12 years. He stopped, in front of the whole pack, and moved the carved chair from the edge of the platform to the place beside his own. And before one word of justice was spoken, the King of the North knelt, in the sight of hundreds, and kissed his mother's scarred hands. The trial lasted 3 days, and the old king's ledger did exactly what his widow had promised it would do. It testified, year by year, sum by sum, in a dead man's patient handwriting. It walked the pack down the silver road south, and no whisper of grief-addled could survive it. Colin broke on the 2nd day, confirming the lodge, the false skirmish story, all of it, his voice flat as a frozen lake. Bram and Gareth were brought back on the morning of the 3rd day by Victor's own riders, delivered to the border, with mocking courtesy, because the Alpha of Iron Ridge had decided that the goodwill of a united North was worth more than 2 spent conspirators, and Victor never gave away anything that had stopped being valuable. The name he sold, in exchange for a border conversation that cost Edward 2 disputed hunting valleys and a decade of grinding his teeth, was the 5th face, and when it was spoken before the trial, the courtyard did not erupt. It went silent in a way that was worse, because the 5th face belonged to Marcus, warden of the eastern villages, a beloved man, a man who had wept at the old king's morning fire, a man whose daughter had been named for the lady he helped silence. The hooded figure who stood back from the lamplight had stood back, it emerged, because he could not bear to be seen, and had spent 12 years being generous to the poor of his villages the way other men pay debts. When they came for him, he was already waiting in his doorway with his affairs in order, and the first thing he said was, "Tell Lady Margaret I never slept." Then came the judgment, and the judgment belonged, by the old law of the Vallon, to the witness. The pack expected weight for weight. 12 years for 12 years, loss for loss. And when Lady Margaret rose on the platform, with the sentence of 5 men in her hands, even her son did not know what she would do, because she had refused to tell him, saying only, "The last 12 years were built on things decided in dark rooms, and I will decide this one under the sky." She looked at the 5 for a long time, and then she said, "I have spent 12 years learning exactly what a life is worth, because I watched mine from the outside like a portrait on a wall. So hear the judgment of the witness. Colin, Bram, Gareth and Marcus would live, stripped of rank and lands, and serve out their years in the farthest work camps of the north, rebuilding the border villages their silver had starved, their names removed from every honor roll, and entered instead, in full, in the Pack Chronicle beside a complete account of what they did. Because, she said, my husband died for the truth being written down, and their punishment is that it will now be written down forever." And Harold. The courtyard leaned in as she turned to the old man who had taken her voice. "Harold," she said, "you built me a cage out of law and called it reverence, and you were 3 steps away for 12 years, watching. So this is your sentence, and I have thought about it for longer than any judge in the history of this pack has thought about any sentence. Exile, alone, to the empty coast beyond the western ranges, to a keeper's cottage where the boats stop twice a year. You will be fed, housed, and protected, and no one, Harold, by decree of this pack, will be permitted to speak one word to you for the rest of your life." She let the shape of it settle over him, over everyone, the perfect turned mirror of it. "You will keep your voice," she said softly. "That is the difference between us. You will be able to cry out to the gulls and the weather as much as you please, and you will learn what I learned, that a voice no one answers is its own kind of silence. Live long, Harold. I am told the coast air is very healthy." For the first time in the memory of the North, Elder Harold had nothing to say. Some in the pack grumbled that Mercy that clever was still Mercy, and that the old spider should have met a shorter end. But the songs that traveled the mountains in the years after told it differently, and the songs were right. The witness had refused to let her freedom begin the way her imprisonment had, with something done in heat that could never be called back, and the pack that watched her choose became, measurably, a different pack. The changes came quickly after that. Edward's first act following the trial was to repeal the ban on the old tongue, and Harold's confiscated library, 3 locked crates of it, was carried into the great hall and opened in front of everyone. The first language of the packs came home. Teachers were found, old wolves from the far valleys who still carried scraps of it, and within a year, the sound of children practicing the ancient words rang through the pack house every morning, and the first word every child was taught, by the king's decree, was Valen, along with the law of it, so that no binding of silence could ever again outlive the memory of its key. "Some traditions protect the pack," Edward said, standing where Harold once stood, "in ways the pack must always be able to understand. Any root a wolf may not dig at is not a root. It is a burial." Victor went home over the mountains with his 2 valleys and his satisfaction, and spent years telling the tale at his own fires, always ending it the same way, with a grudging shake of his head. "I went north to watch a strong house crack," he would say, "and I watched a silent old woman speak one word and make it unbreakable instead. Learn from me, pups. Never bet against a mother with a good memory." Lucy never returned south. The pack would not hear of it, and neither would the East Wing. She remained as healer of the king's house, and in time as far more than that, family in every way that counted, and the Pack Chronicle records, in its account of these years, one small entry that the chronicler could not resist including, that the Southern healer who ended 12 years of silence with 11 ordinary kind words was formally granted, by unanimous voice of the council, the right to be extraordinarily nosy in perpetuity. And Lady Margaret lived at the center of it all, in rooms with every door unlocked. She talked, people said fondly, more than any 3 wolves in the north together, as if working through a stored account, and she was owed every word of it. But the mornings were the thing. The mornings became the pack's quiet ritual, the one the border songs never quite captured because it was too small and too large at once. Every wolf who crossed the courtyard where a silent lady once sat like a ghost, now greeted her by name. Every single one. The guards, the cooks, the children, the king. "Good morning, Lady Margaret." "Fine day, Lady Margaret." And she answered every one. Every time, without exception, because she had spent 12 years learning that there is no such thing as a small word freely given. On soft evenings she sat in the stone courtyard under the bare tree, on the same bench where everything had turned, and beside her, wrapped in a rough old servant's blanket that both of them refused to replace with anything finer, sat Lucy. Sometimes they talked for hours, sometimes, having earned it, they simply sat, watching the moon come up over the mountains, in a silence that was finally, entirely, their own.